1347. The Mongol Empire is the largest military force on the planet, marching relentlessly toward Europe. But their advance hits a literal wall at the port city of Caffa, in modern-day Ukraine, where a grueling siege grinds to a halt. Frustrated and watching their own troops die from a mysterious illness, the Mongols make a calculated, gruesome decision. They load the contaminated corpses of their fallen soldiers into catapults, lobbing them right over the city walls. The attackers didn't understand the microscopic mechanics of what they were doing. To them, disease was just an act of God. But inside the bodies of their dead allies, a highly contagious bacteria was fermenting. Panic swept through Caffa as the bodies piled up in the streets. A few desperate residents managed to board merchant ships and flee the city, unwittingly carrying the lethal passenger with them across the Mediterranean. That single grisly tactical choice was the spark. But a spark only destroys the forest if the timber is dry, and 14th century Europe had spent decades building the perfect powder keg. In the preceding centuries, Europe's population had exploded, jumping to nearly 450 million. This rapid growth heavily outpaced their agricultural technology, meaning millions of people were constantly hovering on the edge of starvation. This diagram illustrates the medieval social hierarchy, the feudal system. At the top, you have the clergy and the landowning nobles, but the entire economy rested on the serfs, an exploited peasant class locked into the bottom tier, trapped producing wealth for everyone above them. To make matters worse, a series of severe climate shifts ruined crop yields, while a brutal conflict between France and England decimated the remaining farmland. You now had an entire continent of overworked, malnourished people with severely compromised immune systems. At the exact same time, humanity was expanding its reach. This map shows the medieval trade networks, like the Silk Road, linking East Asia straight through the Mediterranean and directly into those starving European cities. By pushing agriculture to its breaking point, hoarding resources at the top of a rigid social pyramid, and opening massive international shipping lanes, human beings had engineered a frictionless, high-speed highway for an incoming pathogen. There is a persistent myth that rats spread the Black Death. That is entirely backwards. The rats were merely the victims and the transport vehicles. The actual assassins were the fleas hitching a ride in their fur. When an infected flea bites a human, it injects Yersinia pestis bacteria into the bloodstream. The pathogen then enters an incredibly short incubation period, quietly multiplying for just 2 to 6 days before launching its attack. The initial fever and chills quickly escalate into agonizing inflammation. The bacteria attacks the lymph nodes, usually near the site of the flea bite, causing them to swell into massive, pus-filled lumps called buboes, which could grow to the size of an orange. As the body's defenses fail, internal bleeding creates dark purple or black spots across the skin, petechiae, giving the outbreak its notorious name. From there, organ failure is rapid, often killing the host in a matter of days. This bacteria thrives in damp, unsanitary conditions, and a medieval city was effectively an open sewer. People routinely threw their waste out the window into unpaved, muddy streets. We provided an environment with zero biological resistance, letting the disease carry through the population unchecked. Nobody knew what a microbe was. The medical establishment was flying completely blind, resorting to aggressive bloodletting or feeding patients laxatives to try and purge the illness, which only dehydrated and killed them faster.
Desperate for an explanation, officials turned to the University of Paris. As this diagram illustrates, their leading scientific theory was that a recent conjunction of Mars and Jupiter had heated the atmosphere, drawing up corrupted, poisonous vapors from the Earth. This miasma, or bad air theory, is why doctors eventually adopted those iconic bird-like masks. They stuffed the beaks with aromatic herbs, believing a pleasant smell could block the toxic vapors. It couldn't. The infected fleas flowed right past the perfume. As science failed, the public looked to the church. Clergy framed the plague as God's punishment for humanity's sins, depicting the divine shooting arrows of disease into towns. In response, desperate citizens organized into roaming bands, publicly starving and whipping themselves to try and earn forgiveness. When neither medicine nor prayer worked, panic turned into paranoia. People looked for someone to blame. Because Jewish communities had strict religious laws regarding hygiene,
they often had lower infection rates. In a horrific leap of logic, their Christian neighbors accused them of poisoning the wells, leading to the mass execution and exile of hundreds of Jewish communities. Deprived of both scientific understanding and spiritual comfort, society's structural pillars completely dissolved. The collapse of authority left millions of people drowning in violent, superstitious terror. Here is a visualization of the population density in Europe. Within a span of just a few years, roughly a third to half of the continent's entire population simply vanished. Cities ran out of graveyard space and began dumping bodies into rivers. Looking at the entire interconnected global web, upper estimates suggest up to 200 million people lost their lives to the disease worldwide. This profound collective grief completely consumed European culture. Art from the period became deeply morbid, popularizing the danse macabre, or dance of death. It was a stark reminder that no matter your wealth, your piety, or your social class, the grave was waiting for everyone. The sheer volume of loss broke the medieval illusion of stability. The surviving population had looked death in the eye on a massive scale, and their worldview could not remain static. Yet out of this demographic crater, a strange economic reality emerged. With nearly half the workforce gone, the endless supply of cheap peasant labor evaporated overnight. As we can see on this balance scale, when the labor supply plummeted, the leverage of the surviving workers skyrocketed. For the first time in history, peasants could dictate their own terms, demand higher wages, and refuse unpaid labor, functionally dismantling the feudal system. At the same time, massive depopulation left cities with a surplus of empty housing, driving rents down. Rural workers packed up and moved into urban centers, taking up trades and commerce, which eventually birthed the modern middle class. The utter failure of superstition to stop the dying broke the monopoly of the old institutions. It triggered a slow pivot toward empirical observation, prioritizing the evidence of our own eyes over ancient texts. This shift didn't produce the microscope overnight, but it established the skeptical mindset that would eventually make it possible. The survivors of the 14th century were left with a broken system and a vacant continent, but in that void, the old hierarchies could no longer hold. By forcing a higher value on human life and a skeptical eye toward authority, the plague became the brutal, unintended mechanism that pushed humanity toward the structures we recognize today.